I don't pretend to know anything about anything, pretty much. I will talk about research ethics. I will talk about some issues that we need to be mindful of. My own area of research is actually quite alien and far removed from the reason why all of you are here today. But I've been around research ethics long enough now to have seen some parallels and actually some research in this area. One of the things I've been looking at, for instance, is in the scholarship of teaching and learning, how adults, in adult education, what motivates adults to learn. And the research there, not unlike some of the research that's emerging in peer and family supports, is that we know that students learn best when they take ownership of their learning. Sound familiar? Yeah. And there's a fair bit of research, surprisingly, in the scholarship of teaching and learning on the support structures that might be in place for students. There's actually a fair bit of research. So coming out of the retreat last week, I saw it as an opportunity. Someone challenged us on, take a look at the research designs out there on peer and family supports, and you'll see that there's very little. And we just heard, So I did go, and I did started doing some searches recently, and there is very little, but it's emerging. So it's a vibrant area to do research. I was surprised, frankly, that the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning has more research than what I've seen here. So that's by way of introduction. Obviously, Suzanne is not here. Suzanne McMurphy, she's the vice chair of the University of Windsor REB, soon to be the chair. Her background is social work, and she's an expert on design, research design, and so on. So unfortunately, she's not here, so you'll have to put up with me. Let's just do a little really quickly here. A few of the things I want to cover is just some general research ethics principles. I think I need to sort of give a little bit of vocabulary there to put us all on the same page. I'm assuming here, not everyone here is a researcher, and not everyone here is involved at an academic institution wherein research is governed by things like a research ethics board. Teaching hospitals often have them as well. But the principles apply across, right? And why do we need these principles? So that's really what I want to focus on with you. I'm wondering if I could just do this. Okay, oh, no, I can't. Okay. I can do this. Sorry. All right, so you heard that part of my background is in philosophy of science, actually. And philosophers tend to think of themselves as above everyone else. It's just, a law of nature. And philosophers like to do things based on principles. So principles should be independent of whatever circumstances that might accrue, right? So on a principled basis, if we want to act ethically, we should act ethically independent of, say, what's the bottom line. That's something that philosophers in philosophical ethics would adhere to. Mind you, that's not what reality is like. I'm not suggesting that we need to always be concerned with the bottom line, but we need to be concerned with other factors that may be in place. So in your world, some factors might be, how many beds do we have? What resources do we have? How many social workers are available? Psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on. Nurses. Right? What does our system have to provide? So within that mess, we need to try to come up with some ethical principles to guide us. So there are three basic ethical principles in the research ethics world. These are world over. The Canadian national policy, the Tri-Council statement on Tri-Council policy statement on the ethical conduct of human research uses these three. The first one is respect for persons. And by the way, all the images I have for you, Creative Commons licensing, so I'm okay to use these pictures. Okay? I just didn't put the link. So respect for persons. That's the first principle. This principle says that what we have to do at all times in research is respect the autonomy of the individual to choose for him or herself whether or not they want to participate in research. The principle also says that anyone who does not have the capacity to choose for him or herself still deserves the protection of this right. So young children, for instance, deserve the protection of being respected. We operationalize this in research by getting free and informed consent from individuals. That's what this is all about. If someone isn't able to give free and informed consent, we may need to get alternative consent. So third-party consent in some cases, not in all. So that's the first principle, okay? The second principle is the principle that says we ought to be concerned with the welfare of individuals. And what that means is the benefits of the research have to outweigh the risks. If they don't, we should not do the research. Now, these first two principles came about because certain awful things have happened in our history. For instance, concentration camp experiments during the Second World War and just before. Neurological studies at various centers all over the world where people were subjected to awful experimentation without their consent and where the risks to them outweighed the benefits, not only to them, but to society and to science. This, by the way, is a statue of beneficence. So the principle of being concerned for welfare says the benefits outweigh the risks, beneficence and non-maleficence. That's ingrained in the Hippocratic Oath, actually. Always do good and try to avoid harm. So the second principle, concern for welfare, says just whatever we do in our research, we need to demonstrate that the benefits outweigh the risks to the individuals in our research. Finally, the last principle is this principle of justice. And the principle of justice is probably the new one on the block. The principle of justice really says something like, who gets to be in the research? How are they chosen? Are the harms and benefits distributed to everyone equally? Okay. We know this in the research world by defining inclusion and exclusion criteria. That's how we do it. But justice really means we're not targeting one group of people because they're targetable. Right? So we might not just go and do studies on, left-handed people just because they're left-handed. Or African American, African Canadian people because they're African Canadian. Or children because they don't know better. Right? In other words, the research has to be founded on merit, on scientific merit, and the people chosen to be in the research, right, need to be chosen appropriately. Right? That's the principle of justice. Okay, so I've just given you pretty much an entire semester course in 5 minutes. So I understand there's some gaps there, and those gaps will be on the final exam, okay? There's a fourth principle that I'm arguing for, and I should put it in here, concern or respect for community, which I think goes beyond just the respect for the individual, but that's another story. One of the lessons learned from research ethics is on the practical side is this idea of health equity. And I know this is a bit of a buzzword or buzz term these days, but let me just sort of go down this road a little bit. This is a painting from the 19th century, just after vaccination came into play. And there was some concern at the time that if you were got vaccinated, vaxa coming from the Latin cow, vache in French, right? Vacha. That you will start developing cow-like features. So you could see some of the people getting vaccinated there, with cows coming out of their different parts of their bodies, right? So there was some concern there. But if we're going to do research, and no matter what the subject matter is, who's served by the research? Now, my role on a research ethics board, to be honest with you, is strictly to protect the rights of research participants, not to help the researchers. I don't want to get in the way of the researchers. I want to make sure that the research is good. But my role is to protect the right of research participants. So who's served by the research? That's an important question. If we want to eliminate important barriers to healthcare services, then what's the research supporting that? So healthcare can be served by some of this. And finally, who gets to participate in the research? So I was surprised actually to hear recently that the peer supports and family members and so on is not a well-researched community. That's that last question. Okay. Some ways of, now I'm going to just jump straight into doing some ethics with you. Some ways of approaching ethics would be to say, let's start with principles in order of priority. So truthfulness and full disclosure might be a higher order principle. Privacy and confidentiality might be high order principles, but in order of priority, it might come down, higher orders at the top, protection of life, right? Equality and inequality, autonomy and freedom. Those are sort of pie in the sky type principles. So when we're looking at ethics, we might start with the pie in the sky principles and sort of trickle our way down and apply it to the everyday. This is a screen that's sometimes used in clinical ethics. Less so in research ethics, but in clinical ethics where we might be dealing with day-to-day things. So if we turn our attention to peer and family support, the science, and the science in scary quotes there, what I mean by science is knowledge, whether it's chemistry, biochemistry, history, sociology, psychology, doesn't matter. They're all sciences. It's emerging. But what's clear is that there is some evidence of the efficacy behind it. That's already there, just like in the world of teaching and learning. One challenge for it is that the research methods tend to be mixed. You get the quantitative, clean sort of stuff, and then you get the dirty, grimy, social science type of research where there's a lot of rich data, but getting to it is a little more difficult. And a lot of the research right now, from what I could tell in just my scan of the research, is this idea that of participant action research is one way to do this. Participant action research is very difficult to pull off. I just had a PhD student graduate in engineering, of all places. She used participant action research to have the workers on an operating line design the process. Who would have thought, right? Not the engineer, but the workers on the line. Right? So participant action research offers us opportunities, but how do we put them into place in order to get to the answers that we wish to get? So here are some of the ethical considerations, and in no order of priority, right? And not an exhaustive list. So who are the participants? Family members, friends, various independent peer supports. How do you get to them? How do they identify themselves to you? And as a researcher, how do you cross that boundary with them? Right? So how do you recruit them? Well, that's easy. I know who they are. Well, how do you know who they are? Well, I'm their psychologist. Well, I'm their family member's psychologist. Wait a minute now. What role are you playing? Are you a researcher or a psychologist? Two different roles. I love researching my own students. When I'm researching them, am I their prof or am I a researcher? Then there's this thing that's actually not written about in the field that I think we need to write about, the bystander issues. And I mean by that is, if I want to do a research study right now, and I said, who would like to participate? Now, everyone in the front row puts their hands up. Everyone in the back row puts their hands up. How about the middle rows? You keep your hands down. How do you feel in the middle row knowing that all these cool people are going to participate? Right? Or that you even know they've participated. Now, it strikes me that when we're doing research on family and peer supports, there's this bystander issue. In fact, that's why we're doing the research to some degree. We want to explore that bystander. We want to bring in, now again, I'm using bystander quite loosely here, we want to bring those people into the research. Right? And now the person suffering from the mental health issues or the addiction becomes a bystander. And they might not be your participant in your research, but they can be affected by it. So that's an issue. Again, who are the participants? So the participants are the peer supports, the benefits to them. Presumably there might be some benefits to the person suffering from the mental health issue and or the addiction. Right? So that's important. By the way, I failed to mention this, what's in italics are the principles to which these issues relate. I've already touched on this one, record management. In the research ethics world, it's called custodianship of the data. Whose data is it? And how's it managed? Is the research record separate from the clinical record? And I think we need to do a lot more work on this. I pride myself, my father-in-law is a psychiatrist, my partner's a midwife, my brother-in-law is a teacher, my eldest daughter's a teacher. They're all professionals. I always walk into the room and I say, I'm not a professional. Woohoo. I don't have a duty of disclosure. I'm just a prof. I could do whatever I want. Right? The only harm I'll do is coming up with a bad idea to myself. Sometimes we have duties of disclosure. So how do you manage your multiple roles in doing the research in this field? This is tricky. The requirements for data retention are different in a professional setting than in a research setting. And researchers need to know the difference between the two. The consent process. I've already touched on that a little bit. And the capacity to consent. Young children just don't necessarily have the capacity to consent. That doesn't mean people suffering from mental health issues don't have the capacity. In fact, just the opposite. And so how we approach the consent process will determine whether or not we respect those individuals as individuals. Yeah? And that leads us into the issue of vulnerable populations versus rendering the participants vulnerable. That's a huge difference. There are only 4 vulnerable populations in the research ethics world. Very young children, persons suffering from dementia, prisoners, and soldiers. Right? Prisoners and soldiers, they could be forced to participate. Right? Freedom to participate, you have to be careful there. Persons suffering from dementia and young children don't have the capacity to consent because they don't have the capacity to be fully informed. After that, it's really important that we consent the people in our research and not render them vulnerable. And I'm sure there are other issues. These are the big ones when I'm thinking about this sort of research. I am cognizant that the only thing between you and lunch is me. So I'll finish on this last point here. Here's the reason why I think in research it has to be done ethically. If you have ethical misgivings about your own research, guess what sort of data you're going to collect from your participants, especially social research. And if your participants have ethical misgivings about what you're doing, guess what sort of data you're going to collect. So in order to do research properly in this area and in any social setting, we have to be ethical. The ethics can't be an afterthought. Okay? Resources, Tri-Council policy statement. Your REB, if you have one. If you don't have one, contact me. I'll talk with you. Talk to a research ethicist. Talk to your colleagues who've gone through this. Okay? Thank you.